Well, hello, friends. It is midweek, and as always, Mark Beresford and I have come together to talk about Bible things between two Sundays.
Excellent.
How are you, mate?
Good. Yourself?
Yeah, yeah, well. Of course, Between Two Sundays is the podcast where in the middle of the week we talk about the readings we've read the week before and that we're living out of, and we have a bit of a longer chat about the readings that we are living into as we approach Sunday. As always, we invite you to join the conversation at betweentwosundays@gmail.com or go over to barefootfollower.life, which is Mark's website, or go to monkindocs.podia.com, which is my website, or you can go to linktr.ee/between two Sundays, where our link tree is, and we'll be there in lots of our different places and spaces, and you can click on those and find us through those avenues. But we'd love to hear what you are hearing and seeing and discovering in the scriptures that we pull from the Revised Common Lectionary each week. Have I missed anything?
There seem to be a lot of places to go.
Just go there. All right, so last week was the second Sunday in Lent, and we had our readings for that. For me, Mark, the Romans reading was the one that really clung on and stuck, particularly verse 16, where Paul writes, "For this reason, it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace." And I know on this program over the last year and however much longer it's been since we've had this program, but grace comes up all the time. And to think about this promise of God that rests on grace, and that rests on really made me think about that it's not by grace God does this, it's the whole thing rests on grace, almost as if Paul is saying that the whole good news of Jesus, the whole gospel, the whole redemption of humanity, the whole understanding what it means to live in how we're meant to live in the world, the whole shebang sits on this pillow, if you like, of grace. And it's almost like, the crown sitting on top of the pillow, someone saying, "Would you like to take it?" That's literally what this is. The whole shebang sits on a pillow, rests on this grace, and it's just put in front of us, and it's a case of pick it up, stick it on your head, to use the crown analogy. Will you embrace this? Will you walk with this? Because it's around you anyway. You can't escape from it. So, but that resting on grace, and the whole idea that the people who seem to be most offended by grace are Christians. In my experience, Christians are incredibly offended by this concept of grace, offended that, God would allow people free access to who God is, that there, in my opinion anyway, isn't some eternal punishment, that there isn't some horrid, drawn out, stretched out, torturous future for anybody, that when Jesus said it is finished, it was literally done, this thing that rests on grace. And that just slapped me around for the whole, leading up to and then out of Lent, as we approach Easter, thinking about this free gift that God has given everybody. It's incredibly powerful, and I think it's one that predominantly, mostly as Christians, we forget, we miss, but there it is again. This whole thing rests on grace. Nothing more to say.
Wouldn't it be great if, Paul, as he ministers to the Roman people here through his letter, I think one of the things he's declaring that rests on grace is actually his ministry, his mission. So it's not just this salvation thing, it's actually all of his life of learning life from Jesus. All of it rests on grace. Everything he speaks into other people's lives rests on grace. So if we're guilty of returning to grace a little bit too often. I think that's a fine space for us to be guilty of in. I can live with that.
Yeah.
In fact, I have often said to myself, look, there are some things I think Scripture is probably not as clear on as many people would like. My default position is grace.
Yeah, it's good.
And I think I've decided I can live there. I can occupy that space and maybe one day stand before God and say, I'm sure I didn't get it all right, but my default position was grace, because as I read the stories of Jesus, I kind of ended up in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to land anywhere else, in my opinion.
Yeah.
What about you, mate? What did you drag out of last Sunday?
Yeah, I'm constantly stunned by the John 3 passage, and especially this claim about those who are born in the Spirit. The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit. And I tried sort of turning this around a little bit in my mind. Is it the people who are a little bit like the wind, the people who are led by the Spirit, or is it people like Nicodemus as we discover the Spirit, that we can't explain it? And maybe both are true. I've kind of lent in my past towards those who are born of the Spirit a little bit wild, and I can still see evidence for that. But I wonder if in this context it's actually saying, Nicodemus, you have been born of the Spirit. You've had your eyes open to what God is doing through the miracles or the signs that you've seen. And you probably won't be able to explain that. This will be something that that is beyond your capacity to understand, give explanation to, and therefore beyond the simple handing on in a formulaic kind of way. It always, every time I read this John 3 passage of Nicodemus, I find myself slightly stunned by those couple of verses, reminding me that the gospel is mystery.
It's particularly John.
Yes.
And the way that John writes
John,
about it.
Yeah. This invitation to the Spirit is not something, it looks uncontrollable in this little passage. And I think that's something we do well to remind ourselves of.
Yeah. I often wish people would not just focus on the 16th verse and to see the far more fuller story that is in John chapter 3.
Yeah.
That it's so much more than 16. Keep going, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. There's some good stuff in there that really draws us into what life in God is really all about. It's not just a one-off event in some sort of salvation event moment. There's actually a whole evolution, if you like, of spirit that happens in this, a whole transformation of who you are, of self, as you become more and more. And it's something that goes on well and truly beyond any salvation event, to put it in that terminology. Everything doesn't happen at one point in time. Everything's done, but the transformation takes time. So there's so much wisdom. I mean, I can't imagine what it would have been like for Nicodemus to walk back into the temple the following week and have everybody say, so you went and talked to Jesus, how'd it go? Well, then again, he came in the cover of night. Did they know? But how did it go? And have Nicodemus go, I could tell you, but boy, there was a lot in it.
There is a fascinating story throughout the Gospel of John that unfolds beyond just this introduction to him.
Absolutely. And what happened that wasn't recorded? What was said that wasn't recorded?
course.
in that meeting. That was the second Sunday in Lent. We are now heading towards the third Sunday in Lent, and the readings for this week are Exodus 17, verses 1 to 7, Psalm 95, Romans 5, verses 1 to 11, and John chapter 4, verses 5 to 42. All of those readings will be listed either in the show notes or down below if you are watching us on YouTube. And of course, you could go directly to lectionary.library.vanderbilt.edu, and you'll find the whole of the lectionary, all 3 years, plus a whole bunch of resources that you can use to get to know the passages each week as you have a look at them. Do you want to kick us off in Exodus 17, mate? Shall we start there?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that.
All right.
Look, this remarkable story that, interestingly enough, is, I think, interpreted, I think we could say, in Psalm 95. So both of them refer to Meribah, this place where the Israelites, as they travel through the desert, find themselves short on water, and God provides miraculously through Moses. Interestingly enough, this is the first miracle like this. Moses does a second one where he's asked to speak to the rock that strikes the rock. So we get this impression that we've got this God who asks us to be attentive in the moment rather than simply repeating what we know has worked in the past. What really struck me about this was this idea that there's a testing going on here. And then in Psalm 95, it's interpreted as hardness of heart. It's a very graphic kind of term, because when a heart goes hard, it's leading to a heart attack. Hearts aren't doing what they're supposed to do at this point. It's the soft heart that's doing what it's supposed to do that actually listens carefully to God and is not, seeking this testing space. I love Moses' humility in coming towards God with all these complaints, how tempting it might have been for him to go and try and solve them all himself. But there's this going to God, knowing that the solutions don't reside in Moses' hands, I think ultimately. A very disturbing reality of faith, I think, that we are often deeply tempted to test God, as though God has something to prove to us. So they were some of my thoughts.
Yeah,
What did you notice?
I'm interested about this wording of test. Why are you testing God? All I said is we're thirsty.
Yeah.
We need some water. I'm trying to work out, Moses comes straight in with, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test God? How is it a quarrel to simply bring their need to the one who's in this place of leadership? And there's a real humanity, I think, in Moses here. Because he's seen we need this as something else? Come on. And that's a real interesting thing. But the thing that strikes me, pardon the pun, about this particular story is that they're in the middle of the desert and there's no water to drink. And yet even the rock can be a source of what they need. And it's something that when you start to have a look at the other passages that we're referring to this week, in particular the gospel, it becomes really, really clear as to perhaps why this story from the Hebrew Scriptures was linked up in the same week as the gospel passage for this week. You have a people who are thirsty and they need water. And in a place where there doesn't seem to be any water, from within that comes living, or comes, don't use the word living water, but it's streams of water. So you could say it was living water. It wasn't stagnant. It wasn't like Moses hit the rock and it cracked open and there was a bowl of stagnant water in there. Moses struck the rock and water flowed from within this hard rock. And again, this will come up when we talk about the gospel, but you talking before about the people's hearts being hardened. Yet where did the water flow from? It flowed from within the thing that itself was hard. And I wonder whether this was some sort of story, an analogy, a metaphor for the people to look at, that even within the hardest of things, the living water can still flow. Yes. And that even from within the hardest of things, thirst can be quenched.
So in that sense, it's a very hopeful story, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a hopeful
rather than
story.
Just a rebuke.
And this is where I kind of don't get the whole thing about the test. And let's remember too, to be fair, we're talking about a story that was written down at a time when you had a whole bunch of people who had lived through an exile and were in the midst of an exile in Babylon. And these stories are written down. And they are meant to be stories of hope. They are meant to be stories of vision of God's provision. And so even in the dryness of this place where we are, can water still flow? Even in this hard place, can water still flow? In this account, yes, it can. Yes, it can. The psalm is an interesting one. It's one that we pray every day in the Benedictine breviary, which I think is probably, as you said, a harken back to the story, which is a reminder to us of this very fact. Because you look at the psalm where it starts with rejoicing and joy. It talks about this amazing God who has done all these wonderful things. Listen to his voice today. Don't harden your hearts. And so I think it's kind of like the first 7 verses are the staff hitting the rock. And then the water can flow. The first 7 verses are like a reminder, this is what can do. And you'll note that back in Exodus, God says to Moses, go ahead of the people, take some of the elders of Israel, take in your hand your staff with which you struck the Nile. So whether Moses had spares in the cupboard or, like a guitarist had a whole staff for every occasion, I don't know. But for some reason, both the writer and God, as recorded by the writer, is incredibly specific here. Go get your staff. Let me be specific about which one, Moses. The one with which you struck the water of the Nile. And so this is the very staff that brought them safely out of Egypt. And so when this staff hits the rock, they would have seen that particular staff, the same one that hit the water, the same one that hits the rock. The one that brought you safely across the river is the one that will get you safely through this desert and lead you safely through this desert. And so, these first 7 verses I kind of see like that staff, the reminder. So there is no need to harden your heart. Yeah. Sorry, you're going to say?
I think that's the key, is memory. The role the staff plays as you pull those 2 stories together. And perhaps that third one that I've referred to, where Moses is asked to speak to the rock as well. The staff is this memory of what God has done, this physical memory. We're thinking about what might be our own physical memories of God's goodness. What might be, and of course, knowing that any physical reminder, I think, runs the risk of becoming an idol.
Yeah.
Which is what happens, later in the, when the rock is struck a second time, after being asked to speak to it. I think, you really do end up with this rod, this reminder tool that God has used, becoming a replacement for listening to God.
Yeah.
So there's a danger with these things as well, and we shouldn't take them, just blindly.
Yeah, and it's understanding that the rod points to two things. I think the staff points to two things. One, it's a reminder of what God has done, but in a way, that reminder of what God has done for us should be a reminder of what God has done in us. So when we're in a difficult situation, there's two ways that this rod can be useful. One is to remind us of who God is, which was what we saw happen here. The other one is to remind us who we are, and to remind us that God has done this in us, and that we are this, whoever that person, that reminder needs to remind us of, so that we can get through a situation, work through the issue, find a solution, live well, do right, whatever it happens to be. So this rod becomes a memory stick, if you like, that is a symbol of God's goodness and God's love and God's graciousness, not just in what terms of what God does on the outside, but also what God does within, which I guess brings us back to the analogy again of the rock, and how the water receded when the rod hit the river, the water flowed when the rod hit the rock.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, a really important reminder, I think, for Israel in this moment. Are we just a bunch of escaped slaves, or are we the people God is calling us to be? And I think they need reminders at this point. It's very human, but they absolutely need reminder symbols around. They need a moment like this. I'm trying to think through the idea that Moses at least interpreted what they were saying as testing. It does seem almost a little unreasonable if you just take the questions on face value. But there's a very clear interpretation of that here, very clear interpretation on his part, and indeed on the Psalms part as well.
Well, that's right. It's not just there, and elsewhere in Scripture.
Yeah, that's right. It's in Hebrews as well. That's right.
All right, so we jump over into the Christian Testament, Romans 5 verses 1 to 11. I think for me, the Lectio on this really brought a couple of things out. The first one was this idea of verse 3, and not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, character produces hope. I got hung up on that word, so much so that I thought,
which one?
Boasting. So I got hung up on it a bit, and I thought, yeah, hung up enough that I'm going to have to look this one up. And what I found was really, really interesting. The word there that's used for boasting, which is a very long Greek word that I'm not going to try and pronounce without having the full thing in front of me, but the word literally means to hold high your head. And so sometimes it's used in terms of boast, but sometimes it's used in terms of glory, to glory something, or to lift high your head and to keep your head up.
Yeah.
And when I thought about it like that, I thought that comes across to me way better than the idea of to boast. And particularly in the modern vernacular, to boast means to puff yourself up and talk about how awesome you are. And I don't think that boasting about our sufferings is becoming of us, if that makes sense. I don't think it's very healthy at all. But to hold our head high when we're suffering, and to look with hope. I mean, the word almost has this idea of holding your head up so you can see where it is that you need to go. And so that was pretty powerful thing for me, that when we're in suffering, we can hold our head up and keep looking to where we go, because the situation that we are in will produce endurance, and endurance produces character, character, hope, and hope does not disappoint us. Verse 5, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that's been given to us. In episode 6 of the Monk on the Mic podcast, I talked to Dr. Patrick Oliver about hope. And he talked about the difference between hope and between, what was the other word he used? Can't remember now, the book's over there. But the idea is that hope isn't telling God what to do. Hope actually holds on loosely and sees how things are for what they are and looks for the way that God is making within that. And so when we hope well, hope isn't sitting there and saying, okay, God, you're going to fix this, and you're going to do it by getting this done and this done and this done and that done and then this, and then everything will be okay. There's my hope. No, because when God then, in God's wisdom, seems to be doing it a completely different way that'll get to the same place, or even a place that's better than where we are, or the timing for whatever reason is going to be different, we find ourselves in a situation where we're bitterly disappointed. But we can never be disappointed with hope. What hope does is it takes this situation and basically says, I'm leaving it completely in God's hands. Doesn't mean we don't do anything, but we listen. That our plan, our idea, our solution, it could even be the right one. But the humble position is to take up hope. And I think that's the important difference. And so here, the reason why hope doesn't disappoint us is because when we're holding on with hope, it's a lot healthier than holding on with some sort of idea that's stuck in concrete. I really say, if you want to go and have a look at that on my other podcast and listen to Patrick Oliver talk about that, it's incredibly powerful. And we talked for nearly an hour and a half, and he was teaching about this hope, and it was just so beautiful. And again, in verse 6, for while we are still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. So there's a timing factor here as well. So part of it has to do with our hearts and what we're holding on to. Are we holding on to our opinion, our ideal, how our thought on the way it should go? Or are we holding on to God's? And are we holding on to, in terms of timing, is this all good things are going to happen in their time? Maybe we have to give the space for that to happen. You could say in many ways this passage does speak to the Exodus passage we just read.
Yes, I agree.
In a lot of ways, that there was a moment when water would come, and the people were getting a bit impatient with that. But in God's good time, God came through, and that they can continue to hope in this God, because as they've been shown at that point a couple of times, God is looking out for them and looking after them.
I wonder if holding these passages together, you get kind of permission to at least look at the Moses story through the lens of hope. And maybe that is the difference between Moses and the people of Israel at this time. That Moses is hopeful and just patiently waiting, and there is this sense of unease or urgency, even in the questions that are asked of Moses. But there is suffering going on here in both these accounts, isn't it? In the Romans account, Paul is pointing us using the word suffering. The Exodus account, I think there is at least uncertainty that could be interpreted through the lens of suffering that causes these people to ask.
Yeah, it's I think Moses, even as you mentioned before, not quickly trying to go away and solve the problem himself, but taking it back to God.
Mm.
That in itself demonstrates hope and patience there. Um, sorry, the other word, I just grabbed the book by Patrick Oliver,
Oh,
which is
yes.
called
Yeah, yeah.
Getting Out of the Way. The other word is expectancy. So when we hold things with expectation, usually it's what we expect to happen. Hope, though, has a slightly different angle to it. He says, hope is not the same as faith. Faith is knowing that it is God's faithfulness to us which will see us through. Hope is not the same as love. Love is responding as God responds. Hope is the link between faith and love. It is the bridge between faith, which is the awareness that we're always in the womb of God, and love, which is the response to that. Hope is the capacity to envision, to enable a bond between knowledge and response. Hope is living in the knowledge of God's hope in us. And so, yeah, and then he goes on to talk about this difference between expectation and hope, which I was talking about before. And these people expected in the Exodus story. And yet Moses, I think, is the one who holds hope. And that's really what Paul's talking about here. There is a justification that's happened, and it's available to us. So much so that when trouble comes, we can hold our head high. And as long as we don't go in with expectancy, but rather enter in with hope, then we will see where God is in our situation, and we'll be able to come through. Not always easy, and life is difficult, but God is there with us in the valley. And that is something that we certainly can be hopeful of.
Yeah. Very much lived out by Paul. I think he did life pretty tough at times. And most often when he writes, he's kind of writing from prison on so many occasions. He writes from these points at which it's anything but reaching to the end of the world, at least in his imagination. Of course, what he writes does reach to the end of the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
A God who is doing so much more than we can ask or imagine.
Or even what he could have asked or imagined.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
John chapter 4, a very lengthy passage this week.
Very lengthy, very well known.
But I think possibly really misunderstood. As misunderstood as the woman is for quite some time there about what the heck Jesus is talking about. Well, you think about it. I mean, first of all, let's remember that, and again, when you're reading a passage like this, it's well worth, looking for things that for some reason the writer has put in there because they're important somehow, because they give us some clues. So we're told that he's in a Samaritan city named Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. And the well that Jacob made is there. And that's where the woman is drawing water, and that's where Jesus is sitting when she comes to the well. What's interesting about this is that this follows immediately on from a story, by the way, where Jesus has been, or John the Baptist has been sharing his testimony about what he was going to be about in the ministry of Jesus and his ministry and how they're different. And it says just before that story that they're in a place which is, I can't remember the name of it now, something, the springs, the Valley of the Springs or something like that, because there was much water there for baptizing. And so Jesus has walked from that place, or where he was staying near that place of many springs, to this conversation next to a well, where he's thirsty, by the way, about water. And so he asks the woman for a drink, and her first reaction is to say, how it is that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman. And this is really important because right there and then, in that first couple of verses, we've got a really good take on where this woman is at. She finds her complete identity in the fact that she's a Samaritan woman who is of a place that, and you'll see this in the verses to come, that is of a place that is specifically connected to Jacob. Remembering that while Samaritans held to the same Jewish faith as the Israelites did, they were not seen in a very good light. The Samaritans weren't seen in a very good light.
Which explains a whole lot of this passage, doesn't it?
Yeah,
she starts off insisting that she's locked out by the Jewish world, but I have this connection with Jacob's well.
Yeah. So the well is connected to me, and I'm a Samaritan woman. So religiously, politically, and in other ways as well, she has created an identity for herself. So that's important to carry as we move forward. And Jesus says to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked me, and I would have given you living water. Now that's a really important point, because the water is alive. And he's talking about now not H2O, but he's talking about something else that he's got. And she says, still not getting it, you don't have a bucket. And it's a really deep well. How are you going to get this living water? Basically, Jesus says to her, we don't need no bucket. So where are you going to get this living water from? And she even harkens back to that religious and political identity again. Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob? Jesus says, you drink from this water, you're going to get thirsty again, which is why Jacob and everybody else for generation after generation after generation has had to keep coming back. But if you drink the water that I have to give you, you'll never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life. So literally Jesus is saying your religious identity, your political identity, your identity as a woman, your identity as a Samaritan, that's not who you are. You've put that on the outside, but within you, there is something else. There is the tap on the top of an artesian well that when I tell you how to uncap it, it's going to flow out of you and you will never be thirsty again. You won't need to identify as a woman or as a religious or a certain religion or as a Samaritan, or even when he talks about her 5 husbands. Notice Jesus doesn't condemn her, first of all. There's no condemnation here at all. He simply points it out. What's he saying? You've had five failed relationships, and you're probably nervous and don't want to go into this next one because you're not sure yet. But stop trying to find your identity in all these things. That's not where it is. Your identity is within you, because that's the identity God has placed within you. Your identity as a child made in the image of God. And when you see that, when that well inside you is uncapped, it'll just keep flowing and flowing and flowing and flowing. The place to worship a bit further down is not on this mountain. It's not in Samaria. It's not in Jerusalem. It's not here. It's not there. It's not geographical. Why? Because it is within you. And so what we have here is Jesus literally trying to unveil these women's eyes to the reality that she is a child made in God's image, and that is going to create in her a way of being where spiritually she will never be thirsty again. She won't have to, as I said, keep hearkening back to these other identities, because her identity will be completely in God, and she won't need to try and find identity and acceptance and love anywhere else. And so your identity is not around you, it's within you. That's the message here. So much so that when Jesus goes on to talk to the disciples, when the woman, by the way, she drops her bucket, she gets it. If she still thought that H2O was of prevalence, I'm not saying that you shouldn't drink water, but if she still thought that that was the main thing, she would have run off with the bucket. She wouldn't have left it. That was a precious commodity. But she got it so much and it excited her so much, she dropped the bucket and she bolts off to go and get other villagers to come out. And while they're gone, Jesus and the disciples have a conversation about bread. Again, trying to explain to them that I'm not talking about physical food, lads and women, because there would have been women there. I'm not talking about eating physical bread. I'm talking about bread that feeds, which is doing the will of God, that is living the God life, that is living out of the image of God that's within you. They're the things that feed you. They're the things that nourish your soul. They're the things that water your heart. They're the things in which to find your identity. And none of it is out there. It's already in you from the moment I breathed life into you and brought you into this world. This is where you need to seek the goodness of God and the depth of God's love for us and the identity that God has for us. Because within each and every one of us, that spirit has been breathed and the kingdom resides. And this God of the kingdom wants to help and open us up to a life of fullness and abundance. This is a beautiful, beautiful story, which again, if you hearken it back to what happened in the desert, same story, just in a slightly less metaphorical way, because they were looking for physical water, but the idea that even in the midst of dryness and barrenness, God will bring forth water from the midst of a hard rock, and water that flows. Likewise, here's this woman who's dry and she's thirsty, who's trying to find her identity, that she holds on to her religion, holds on to her nationality, holds on to her claim within, the political realm of who's right and who's wrong, is going after all these men around her because she's trying to find fulfillment in them. And yet Jesus comes to her and says, all of those things are going to leave you consistently thirsty. But if you allow that little wellspring to be uncapped rather, and tapped, it will not just well up and over into your life, but it will overflow out of your life and into the life of others. This is an incredible story of finding hope again and finding water when we're incredibly barren through the well that God has placed inside every single one of us.
Love what you're saying there. I think it's really important that we at least acknowledge that this story never speaks of her as immoral. So I think there could be a whole lot of circumstances that create the embarrassment that might want to avoid coming when, this midday thing has raised lots of questions. Most would come in the cool of the day rather than the heat of the day. There's a whole lot of things other than moral, within immorality that could cause someone to want to avoid others. There's every possibility that a number of these husbands have died.
That's right.
There's every possibility that these husbands have treated her poorly and sent her away. That there's that certificate of divorce that Jesus refers to in Matthew 5. There are a lot of possibilities here other than that she is simply an immoral woman. And this, this man that is not her husband now, this could be a basic survival need for her. I think there's a lot of reasons for us to at least hold very, very carefully to the interpretation that she has lived an immoral life.
Absolutely.
She could, I say all of those other possibilities because I think they add up to the possibility that she's a victim, that she's been treated very poorly by others. And I think that's worth, at least as we read this story this coming Sunday, holding to that possibility. The other thing that always strikes me about this is the testimony that she she takes into Samaria. And it's summarized here at the end. He told me everything I have ever done. Of all the things that that she could take from this discussion, she takes something deeply, deeply personal. And what is crystal clear is she has not gone into Samaria with the fivefold gospel or the four, the 4 points of the death and resurrection of Jesus. She just hasn't done that. What she's gone in there with is an experience. And John calls this a testimony, which in some ways is very natural. In other ways, the way some as parts of the church would use the word testimony, this doesn't qualify. But this is her deeply, deeply personal story. She says almost nothing about Jesus. But she goes in and who Jesus has made her speaks volumes to those around her, and she comes out. In some ways, I don't know, but in some ways the testimony is, if she's embarrassed trying to hold back because people know things, this testimony isn't even dramatic. If she's embarrassed because everyone knows her past, encountering someone who tells her everything she's done is probably not even surprising. But what if this is really true, that she that in speaking of this living water, in taking the time to know her, Jesus has in a very real way spoken to the very depths of who she is, which is the experience, I would suggest, of the Samaritans as they come out and meet Jesus for themselves, and eventually are left saying, we believe because we've encountered him, not just because of your testimony, which is a beautiful account. This whole thing is, to me, is a wonderful account of, I think, a broken person who stays in conversation with Jesus, even though I don't think she understands it. You're absolutely right. She is going in completely different directions to where Jesus is heading. She stays in that conversation and at least knows enough by the end to know she has been seen. Mm. And that is the testimony she takes to the world. And from there, they come out and they see for themselves. Lots of echoes of, all that in John 1, all that the disciples got another disciple and took them to Jesus, and then they saw Jesus and went and said, we think we've found the Messiah. Will you come? There's a lot of that going on here, making our testimonies important rather than our explanations of the gospel as important.
Yeah.
And it is all this, this constant inviting of people to see for themselves rather than I'm going to explain to you what I've seen. And I think this woman is probably the last person who's going to become the first evangelist, or the first evangelist beyond the borders of Israel. Yet she's such an unexpected character here, and really breathes hope, I think, into the Gentile world as they encounter Jesus through the Gospel of John.
And it does seem to be a theme within John. Of course, we think back to Thomas, who famously in John says, until I see it, see it with my own eyes and put my fingers in the nail, I'm not going to believe. John is the one who wrote about the man who was blind, who went before the Pharisees and basically throws up his arms and says, look, I was blind, now I see.
Yes.
That's all I
Yes.
know. Which, there's this idea that our testimony has to be long and drawn and full of theological. No,
Yes.
I think the thing that, and maybe this is where we've lost it in the church, we've forgotten that the world needs hope, and the world wants to hear stories of hope.
Yeah.
And the world doesn't need convincing. The world doesn't need their arm twisted. The world doesn't need to be proof text, and it doesn't need to be apologeticized, if that's even a word. What it needs is to hear stories of hope,
Yeah.
honest stories of hope, not convoluted, not necessarily, like I said, this is a very undramatic story.
Yes.
Imagine running into the village, and I love the way you pointed this out. Come and hear a man who told me everything that I've ever
Everything
done.
I've done.
Like, imagine the whole town going, yeah, so
Yeah. We already know what you've
we all
done.
know.
It's not surprising that he does.
But that's the point.
Yeah.
That it's relatively undramatic. And I
Mm.
think the more we've got towards dramatic conversions and dramatic, numbers of people and dramatic growth of things and whatever else you want to make dramatic, I think the more we've got away from the simplicity and the honesty and the grassroots of what the good news is. And I think I said it in many words, and you said it in just a few, Mark, and I think it's perfect. And the good news for this woman is you are seen.
Yes.
I
Yes.
see you.
Yes.
And I want you to know that everything you need is already in there.
Mm.
God's put it in there because you're made in God's image.
Yeah.
Uncap it, let it fly. That's pretty much it. That's the good news. And imagine what the world would look like if we took those good news stories um, and the more simple, and I'm not necessarily against the miraculous, but the less miraculous and the less dramatic, the better.
Mm.
Um, I'm all for the stories of I was broke and then we prayed and went out to the mailbox and there was a check for $200 sitting in the mailbox. I can't deny your experience, and I'm not even going to try to. What you've experienced could very well have been God, and that's fine. But what the world needs to hear is life was really shitty, and my next door neighbor came over and sat with me and made me a casserole. And the next day it was still really shitty. But boy, it gave me a glimmer of light in a really dark place.
Mm.
That's the sort of testimony people need to hear.
Yeah.
I was seen. I was cared for. Someone knocked on my door and to check that I was okay after the storm. That simple stuff. And this woman's life and story, as dramatic as it is, I mean, there's a soap opera in the midrash of this somewhere, doesn't even go there. Story doesn't need to go there. Because and I imagine that one of the reasons why they followed wasn't just because she said, come meet a man that told me everything I've ever done. Maybe it's the Messiah. I reckon her demeanor would have said something. Because here's a woman who I think, and again, to put it in your words, had been relatively unseen or pushed to the margins. And somebody, not just any somebody, but a male Jewish rabbi has seen her. Wouldn't that pep you up if you were in her position at that time, at that age, and that era? Of course.
Yeah.
So it's a beautiful story of water and hope, and the water that's found when our hope becomes something that's real.
I was really I'm pleased that you touched on Thomas, because I think Thomas's story is the whole story of the Gospel of John. Even those who claim to witness miracles, and I say that in kind of inverted commas, in John, there is this. There is a way of reading many of the miracles where they're not the miracles. The impossible moment is not actually seen. I'm thinking of the water into wine.
Yep.
The servants just take off. They fill these. They do this act that Jesus has asked them to do. They fill these jars with water, and then they take them off, and just somewhere in the middle there, it becomes water to wine. So they know what's happened, but they haven't seen it.
Yeah.
I think the resurrection of Lazarus is exactly the same. They, undo the tomb, unwrap him, because a miracle has occurred and right next to you, but you haven't seen it. I think the resurrection of Jesus is exactly like this in the Gospel of John. So when we get to that moment where Thomas is commended, Jesus points to happy are those who haven't seen. I think this is a theme that's been going on all the way through John. You can even see this with the blind man who is healed on the way. So Jesus rubs the mud on his eyes, sends him off, and he goes off to wash it off. And on the way, he sees. So it's completely, these are unwitnessed. We witness the, we witness that things have changed in these miracles, but we don't witness the moment.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really significant there in the Gospel of John that's been building up from the very beginning. You could even say this of the disciple at the beginning of John, who is amazed because Jesus claims to have seen him under the fig tree. He knows nothing of this except Jesus' testimony to what he's actually seen. He didn't experience that in the moment. He's just sitting under the fig tree doing whatever he was doing. But Jesus' capacity to speak into that actually helps him see that more was going on than he'd realised.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important study to be done in the Gospel of John. It may be that someone's done it and I haven't seen it, but to me that seeing indirectly is a very strong theme in the Gospel of John. And I wonder if there's something of this in this story as well, that this woman has seen Jesus indirectly.
Well, she says herself,
could this be the Messiah? Is absolutely wonderful. I think that's legendary. It's so unsure, really, so far from, I've got to convince you, but just come and see for yourself.
Yeah, and the seeing goes back the other way too. That she has seen is Jesus Messiah, but Jesus has also seen her in her moment. And I would even say that a miracle's occurred in her life.
Yes.
If you want to put it that way, there's a dramatic change because she feels seen, she feels known.
Yes.
And I have no doubt that she experienced what that living water felt like. She experienced what it was to be loved, noticed, without having to be stuck in a certain pigeonhole of Samaritan, we live near Jacob's well, I'm a woman, and she even tries to pull Jesus into that little argument, by the way, because she says, who are you, a Jewish man, to ask me, a Jewish woman, or a Samaritan woman, for water? So she's even tried to say, this is just who we are. And Jesus
which is precisely what putting ourselves in pigeonholes does. It does exactly the same for everyone around us.
Yes.
As soon as we identify ourselves within, a little box, we are automatically identifying others as outsiders.
Yeah, that's right. Once I'm this, then you are that.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So that's precisely what's happening.
Yeah.
And what we tend to do all the time.
Yes.
We do this with ourselves all the time. And with
And yet,
others, of course.
of course, the message of Easter is the complete epitome of that. It's the opposite. Um, the message of Easter is that before, to go back to Romans here, while we were still sinners, while we were still separated from God, while we still couldn't see who God was, Christ died for us.
Yes.
And made it available.
A display
and
of
possible.
A display of unfathomable grace and love.
Absolutely. Which is, again, what this woman experiences here at the well.
Yeah. Mark, I haven't necessarily got the answer to this, but I am wondering how closely we can relate these passages to Lent. Because we are in the middle of Lent, the third Sunday of Lent. What do these passages have to say into this experience of leading to Easter Sunday, leading to resurrection, and self-preparation of the Lenten season? Can see this warning of hardened hearts quite clearly. The invitation of living water, perhaps, fits in there.
Well, the whole of Lent kicks off with dust and ash. We've got some fires blaring around our area right now. In fact, every now and then we've got the fire rescue or the fire water chopper flying over to fill up and go back to the fire. So there's a bit of smoke around and all that sort of thing. But in this week set of readings, that whole theme of water and softening and hope, the softness of hope. I think for me, if I was going to take anything in terms of Lent, it's that, rain stops the dust from flying around. When the water comes and flows, that dust grows beautiful fruit and green grass and plants, and the animals come and feed from it. And I think that there's an incredible hope in these readings for us, that in the midst of this time of penitence and repentance and, seriously looking at our lives and how they're going, that to realize in the midst of all that, that there is this living water that flows within us, and that we should be permitting that water to flow over the hardened ground of our hearts, the dusty ground of our souls, and to soften the rock of our spirit, so that water can flow out of us to others.
I like that. I find myself wondering in this season of fasting as well, what it looks like for us to sit with Jesus, being satisfied with doing the will of God and forgetting to eat. that it is actually a physical satisfaction that Jesus undergoes. Anyway, I just thought that question was worth asking.
No.
And what's the end?
I don't have anything to necessarily share, but that's another whole part of this passage and conversation that is worth contemplating too, that conversation between Jesus and the disciples about the bread and the food.
Yes.
So I think there's some incredibly powerful stuff there. That, my friends, is the third Sunday in Lent. Exodus 17, verses 1 to 7, Psalm 95, Romans 5, verses 1 to 11, John 4, verses 5 to 42. Jump on all those links, which you'll find in the show notes or below if you're watching on YouTube, all the same ones that I mentioned at the start of the show. And we'd love to hear what's going on for you. What's your story? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? How have these verses and passages spoken to you? And a great question, which I'll probably write in the show notes for those who are on Spotify. I think it'll appear. Where I'll put the question, how does this passage speak to us in the midst of Lent? And you can respond there too if you listen to us on Spotify. There you go, mate. We're done.
Very good.
Awesome. So until next week, when we'll sit down and have a natter about the fourth Sunday in Lent. See you all next week, folks. See you, mate.
See you then.
Cheers.